Hello, and welcome to marketing91.com.
The main factors influencing price changes and hence the incidence of taxation are elasticity of demand and supply, cost conditions, and market structure. Elasticity of demand and supply. Price changes are governed by relative elasticity of demand and supply. Therefore, a tax can be shifted only by means of a shift in demand-supply curves. The sharing of incidences between seller and buyers is governed by demand and supply elasticities. The greater the elasticity of demand, the larger is the incidence on sellers. The greater the elasticity of supply, the larger is the incidence on buyers. Price elasticity of demand equals the percentage change demand of quantity demanded divided by percentage change in price, whereas price elasticity of supply equals the percentage of change in quantity supplied divided by percentage change in price. Let's start with elasticity of demand. The sharing of tax burden between sellers and buyers under different demand elasticities is explained below. Case 1. Perfectly elastic demand. Under perfectly elastic demand, given supply elasticity, the entire tax burden is on the seller. Let's understand perfectly elastic demand through a graph. Curve D in the graph represents demand curve. This curve is horizontally plotted to indicate perfectly elastic demand. Curve SS represents original supply curve before tax. Curve S1 is the new supply curve when tax is imposed. The curve shifts upwards to the left because the same output quantity will be supplied at a higher price. The vertical distance between the two supply curves indicates the tax imposed. The equilibrium changes from E to E1 and the equilibrium output falls from OQ to OQ1. However, the price remains unchanged at OP. Therefore, the whole tax burden, that is the incidence, is absorbed by the seller. TE1 is the tax per unit. TE1PN is the total tax paid. Case 2, relatively more elastic demand. In this case, a larger tax burden is on sellers and a smaller burden on buyers. In the graph, the flatter demand reflects relatively more elastic demand. After considering tax, supply curve shifts from SS to S1, equilibrium from E to E1, and price from OP to O1. TE1 is the total amount of tax. TE1 P1N represents total tax paid. ME1 P1P shows the total tax absorbed by the buyer. TMPN represents total tax absorbed by seller. A larger part of the tax burden is borne by the seller and a smaller one borne by the buyer. Case 3. Relatively less elastic demand. When demand is relatively less elastic and a larger share of tax is paid by buyers and a smaller share by sellers. In the graph, after tax, price increases from OP to OP1 by amount PP1 or ME1. TE1 is the total tax amount. Of tax amount T1, larger portion of tax is paid by the buyers and smaller proportion by sellers because ME1 is greater than TM. In other words, of the total burden of TE1 P1N, ME1 P1P shows the amount paid by the buyer. TMRN shows the amount paid by seller. In this case, sellers have the room to pass on most of the tax burden to the buyers. Case 4. Perfectly inelastic demand. When the demand is perfectly inelastic, all taxes are borne by buyers. In the graph, demand curve D is vertical. Because demand doesn't change after tax, prices increases by tax amount EE1. Hence, all taxes are paid by buyers. EE1 P1P shows the entire tax burden. Now let's move on to understand elasticity of supply. The extent of change is price, or the extent to which tax can be passed on to buyers depends on the degree of supply elasticity. Assuming constant demand elasticity, the greater the supply elasticity, the greater is the burden on buyers. Case 1. Perfectly elastic supply. When supply is perfectly elastic, all tax is borne by buyers. Let us understand this concept graphically. The supply curve S horizontal indicating perfect elasticity. After tax S1, the new supply curve, and E1 is a new equilibrium. Prices increases from OP to OP1 by the tax amount TE1. Therefore, buyers near the entire tax burden. Area TE1 P1P represents total amount of tax. Case 2, relatively more elastic supply. When supply elasticity is relatively higher, a greater share of tax burden is borne by buyers and smaller share by sellers. Let's understand this case through a graph. The supply curve is flatter. After tax, prices increase by PP1 or ME1, and this increase is lower than the tax amount TE1. ME1 is a part of tax borne by buyer, and TM represents remaining part of tax borne by seller. ME1 P1P is the total tax burden on buyer. MPNT is the total tax burden on seller. Buyers pay a larger share of tax on sellers. Case 3, relatively less elastic supply. In this case, a larger proportion of the tax burden is borne by sellers and a smaller proportion by buyers. Let's look at the graph to understand this case. The supply curve is relatively steeper. After tax T1, price increases by PP1. ME1 represents smaller share of tax absorbed by buyers. TM represents larger share of tax borne by sellers. ME1 P1P is the total tax burden on buyer. TMPN is the total tax burden on the seller. Case 4, perfectly inelastic supply. In this case, the tax burden is borne in full by sellers. The graph will help us understand perfectly inelastic supply. When the supply is perfectly inelastic, sellers are unable to adjust supply after tax. In this case, the price is unchanged. Therefore, the tax burden is borne in full by sellers. Moving on, when the demand elasticity and supply elasticity are equal, the tax burden is divided equally between sellers and buyers. The table summarizes the share of burden faced by buyer and seller in different cases of elasticity. Your ED is demand elasticity and ES is supply elasticity. The greater the demand elasticity, the lower is the likelihood of sellers passing taxes onto the buyers. We have learned that the greater the supply elasticity, the higher is the likelihood of sellers passing taxes onto the buyers. The next topic is cost conditions. Tax incidence is also influenced by returns to scale or cost conditions. Cost may decrease, remain constant, or increase depending on whether returns to scale increase, remain constant, or decrease respectively. In case of decreasing cost, the average cost per unit output decreases as output increases. The tax burden on buyers is greater than the tax amount. In the graph, the SS curve is a supply curve which slopes downwards, indicating a decrease in cost under equilibrium E. OP and OQ represent the pre-tax price and output respectively. S1 curve represents new supply curve after levy of tax with new equilibrium E1. We can observe that rise in price, which is indicated by PP1 or NE1, is greater than the tax amount TE1. Thus, price rise includes the entire tax burden and the increase in cost. It's been learned that the burden on buyers is greater than the tax amount under decreasing cost conditions. Under constant cost, according to this concept, cost per unit output remains unchanged. In this case, producers shift the whole tax burden to the consumers. In the graph, the supply curve is a horizontal line. After levy of tax, the supply curve shifts upwards from S to S1 by tax amount TE1. Post-tax price increases by TE1 or PP1. Hence, the whole tax burden is shifted on the consumers. Under increasing cost, this concept says that cost per unit rises as output increases. In this case, only a portion of tax liability can be passed on to the buyers. In the graph, supply curve is upward sloping. Line QE or OP indicate per tax price. After levy of tax, the supply curve shifts upwards from SS to S1 by the tax amount TE. The price rises, which is indicated by NE1 or PP1, and is less than the tax amount TE. It is observed that the price rises partially and only a part of the tax burden is passed on to the buyers. The last topic is on market structure. The first is incidence under perfect competition. There are multiple buyers and sellers, and they do not influence price. Supply elasticity depends on factors such as nature of commodity, time, and cost condition. For perishable goods, supply is relatively inelastic, therefore sellers bear most of the tax burden. For durable goods, supply is relatively elastic, so sellers can pass on the tax burden to buyers wholly or partially. In terms of market period, supply is fixed. Therefore, it is not possible for sellers to pass on any tax burden. In short periods, supply is relatively inelastic. Therefore, sellers cannot pass on much tax burden to buyers. Over long periods, supply is more elastic and buyers have greater room to shift taxes to sellers. Next is incidence under monopoly. Sellers are price makers because of the lack of any close substitute for the commodity. Monopolists determine the output and the price of product to maximize profit. A tax on this output increases cost. Whether monopolists can pass on a tax burden to consumers is contingent on the nature of the tax. We analyze tax under monopoly with respect to two types of taxes: unit or specific tax and lump sum tax. Incidence of a unit or specific tax. Selective sales tax is a fixed tax per unit of product sold. Monopolists limit output such as MR equal to MC. However, the imposition of a unit tax increases the monopolist's unit cost. Therefore, to maximize profits, the monopolist will limit output further to secure higher price and pass on the tax burden. Point E in the graph is original equilibrium, where MR is equal to MC and OQ and OP are original output and price. Imposition of tax T1 on a commodity raises production cost, resulting in shifting of the marginal cost curve to MC1. E1 is the new equilibrium and PP1 is the increase in price. The tax per unit T1 is given by the vertical distance between the marginal cost curves. In the figure, price has not risen by the full amount of tax, that is, PP1 or AN is less than TE1. Thus, PP1 or AN is a tax burden passed on to the buyer and the remainder is paid by the monopolist. Incidence of lump sum tax. Typically, lump sum tax is imposed on profit or as a license fee. In this case, the monopolist does not pass on tax burden onto buyers and bears it because lump sum tax is independent of supply and price. TC curve starts from F because OF is the total fixed cost. TR curve is the total revenue curve for monopolist. OQ is the profit maximizing output. Here, the slopes of TR and TC curves are equal. That is, the tangents TT and T1 are parallel to each other. CR corresponding to output OQ is a maximum profit before tax. Lump sum tax FF1 is imposed as a fixed cost to be paid by the monopolist. Hence, the total cost curve shifts to TC1 and the profits decrease to C1R. In this case, the best output continues to be OQ because RC1 is the highest monopoly profit after tax. This means price or quantity does not change and the tax is absorbed by the monopolist. Thus, we may conclude that a specific tax and a monopoly may be shifted, but a lump sum tax and a monopoly cannot be shifted.
Thank you.